directed me through a national park. I posted this story in a thread on Nature Pics subreddit and was told I should post it somewhere like this. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier, like not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and hear something. Open my tent, and there's a guy sitting by where my fire had been, right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular-looking dude just sitting there a couple feet away from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge like he'd just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well, after writing it off as just some odd occurrence and a guy that was probably high or something, and I managed to set up a camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said, "No, I don't even think that's a real place there." They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away." And kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I did. After like 15 minutes of me being freaked out and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gone closer, so I shone my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days because there's no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot as vast as the wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but I didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This one could have been written off because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walk in circles outside my tent. But by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly decided sounded like more like a human making animal calls. But it could have actually been an animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this date, it was probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was, or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation. But I can't really articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. My experience in the woods. I'm fairly new to Reddit, so only discovered this sub recently, using a throwaway account here because I didn't feel comfortable enough sharing this on my main account. I've looked for a little while, and I think it's the perfect place to share the story of an experience I had about 9 to 10 years ago. The reason I'm sharing this is, A, because that's the point of the sub and I've enjoyed reading others' experiences, but B, to see if anyone has a similar experience or an idea of what this could have been, because I never have. Before I start, I've told this story to lots of people over the years, friends, family, even acquaintances, whatever supernatural/scary stuff has come up in conversation, but I've always left out the finer details on purpose because honestly, I think I have some latent trauma from it. I don't like going into details about it or reliving this experience. Instead, I've only recounted this as a 60-second scary story to elicit a reaction, probably as a coping mechanism. My girlfriend is the only person I've ever told the full story to. To be clear, I am not trying to convince anyone of anything here. You can believe what you want, and I respect your opinion. But I'm also not going to debate or argue over something I know to be true. This experience happened when I was wild camping on my own in a forest in Wales. I live in England near the Welsh border. This is something I've done dozens of times and continue to do to this day. I think it was April or May of 2013 or 2014. Weather was unseasonably good, and this was the second of 3 nights that I've planned for my trip, although it ended up being the last. First night and second day had been great. Got a lovely long hike in, followed by a pub lunch. I'd driven back to the area I was staying, and I was now back in my tent. I settled down for the night, read a book, and had some beers and went to sleep. It was probably between 11 p.m. and midnight. I was just in that state where you're semi-conscious about to drift off, but haven't quite yet. I slowly became aware of a melodic noise somewhere outside the tent. Didn't sound that close, but maybe within like 50 feet. It sounded like a person perfectly humming a tune. After listening for a couple of minutes, it was definitely somebody humming a tune. When I say perfectly, I mean just that. It sounded like a professional singer or something, because it was perfectly in tune. No voice breaks or falters at all. I can't remember whether it sounded like a man or a woman. At this point, I'm shitting myself because it's just incredibly creepy, like something from a horror film. I hadn't left my tent at this point, and the humming hadn't gotten any louder. It just stayed a distant background noise. I didn't know what to do, but knew I couldn't just stay there forever. So I mustered the courage to open my tent as slowly and quietly as I could to see if I could see or tell where the noise is coming from. Within 5 seconds of me poking my head off the tent, the humming stopped. It didn't fade away or something. It just stopped dead, as if someone had pressed pause on a recording. I'm still very on edge at this point, but at the time, I assume that's just what it is. Somebody playing a prank on solo campers with an audio recording. I literally couldn't think of any other explanation. Based on that assumption, I shouted something like, "You're not funny, fuck off." That made me feel a bit better because it felt like I'd addressed the issue. I don't know, but for whatever reason, it helped my nerves a bit at the time. I let that hang in the air for like 10 more seconds whilst my head is still poking out of the tent, and it stays quiet. I'm kind of satisfied by this point, so I begin moving back in. As I'm reaching for the tent zipper, though, the humming starts again. Same tune, but much louder, much closer, and from the completely opposite direction. My heart completely sinks because there is no way someone could have moved from the first source of the noise to the second without me seeing or hearing something. Literally impossible. It was perfectly quiet in the woods, not even any breeze against leaves. And yeah, it was dark, but I could still see short distances thanks to the moonlight. In the back of my mind, though, my subconscious is clearly working overtime trying to rationalize this. And I guess I must have assumed that there were multiple pranksters out there with multiple audio recordings. I can't exactly remember what my thought process was at this point because it's truthfully all a blur. But for one reason or another, I stormed angrily out of the tent towards the now quite loud sound. It sounded as if the person humming was within like 10 feet of the tent. I got up out of the tent, turned towards the noise, ready to scream at the perpetrator or even attack if necessary. That's when I see this humanoid figure silhouetted against the tree line, maybe 15 feet away from me. My best description of it is this. It was a large, thin figure that was shaped like a human, but way too tall and proportionated all wrong. It was huge. I would have guessed over 7 feet. Its limbs were unnaturally long, like it had been stretched out in all directions. Its head appeared very small and rounded. I think the figure was grey in color, but I can't be 100% sure because of the poor visibility. I couldn't make out much of its face at all. It just seemed to be shrouded in shadow. I definitely didn't notice any features like eyes, mouth, or nose. It was standing quiet, still facing directly towards me. I say quiet, still, because there was some movement. In the same way that a person or animal would sway back and forth, or make some minor body movements, etc. If they were standing up, this was a real living thing. I know that for a fact, not an illusion, not a prop or prank. This thing was standing right in front of me and was aware of my presence. I'm literally paralyzed by fear at this point. I've never felt anything like it before or since. Just a primal terror which had left me cold, shaking, and just standing there quite literally unable to move. I distinctly remember thinking that I need to get away, but I could not physically move my body. It was the most terrified I had ever been. As I first laid eyes on this creature, the humming stopped and immediately it started humming again. But not a song. It started softly singing my name, in what sounded like my voice. That sounds fucking ridiculous, I know, but I swear that's how I remember it. Even though it was singing in my voice, though, it didn't sound right. The syllables were just off, as though a non-human had heard speech once and was trying to mimic it for the first time, poorly. I haven't described that well, but I don't think I know the words to do so. This can have gone on for more than 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. Me standing there, this creature standing, motionless and singing my name. At some point, though, every cell in my body just switched and I managed to turn and run as fast as I ever have in the opposite direction. For maybe 2 minutes, I was literally sprinting through the woods in just my socks and PJs, with absolutely no other thought in my mind other than putting distance between myself and that thing. I had no idea which direction I was going or how I'd make it back to my tent. When I eventually stopped, I just leaned against this tree, panting for ages. The forest was still completely silent. I must have stayed by that tree for about 2 hours, waiting for my heart rate to settle, trying to calm down and decide what to do. I didn't want to go back to my tent. I was quite happy to leave all my stuff there, but I needed my phone and car keys to get home. I was several miles away from anywhere. I eventually made my way back slowly. It wasn't too hard to navigate back to my tent in those woods because the tree distribution wasn't very dense. I also hadn't gone as far as I feared, though. Once back in my tent, I grabbed just my phone and keys and went back to my car as fast as I was comfortable. Spent the rest of the night sitting in the back seat on my phone, shaking. Didn't even try to get any sleep. Once the sun was up, I managed to go back and pack my stuff up and left as quickly as I could. After that, I took a 2+ year break from solo camping, something I normally do every 3 to 4 months. So that's my experience. Make of it what you will. That has stayed with me ever since, and I know it always will. I don't know what was in the woods with me that night, but it has scarred me and transformed the way I think about supernatural experiences, etc. If anyone has encountered anything similar to what I just described, I'd be interested to hear. Thanks for reading, and sorry this was so long. Lol. There's something up with the Appalachians. I spent my life in Georgia and love hiking all over, but I must admit, North Carolina has the best mountains. For this reason, I frequently drive up there and hike and camp. This time I went up with my family in an RV and stayed with them in Maggie Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the Cold Mountain Trailhead, and I planned to hike up, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I'd never camped alone. On top of that, I didn't bring a pistol, something I won't go without now. On the way up, the trail was surprisingly strenuous. Not necessarily steep. I've hiked some steep stuff out of west, but more like a ton of ups and downs and feeling like it wouldn't end. Eventually, it began to get darker, and I realized I needed to stop and set up while I still had light. So I stopped about half a mile short of the summit and figured I would continue in the morning. Nothing eventful happened. I set up camp in a really good spot, ate my food, and went into the tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't run into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't eerie at the time, but soon would be. I have trouble sleeping, and usually lay awake for up to an hour trying to sleep. During this, I thought I heard someone lightly walking around the general area because of the rhythm of the steps. I brushed it off as my mind running wild, but I did pull my big old knife out of my bag and put it next to me in the sleeping bag. That morning, I woke up and ate some oatmeal. As I ate, I looked over at my tent and noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries tied with green cord propped against my tent. It'll see if I can find a picture put in the comments. Internally, I was pissing myself because I packed my crap up and took off within 5 minutes. In no way I bothered to go to the summit. I headed straight down. On the way down, I realized I was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up on a side trail that eventually ended and I was lost. I used a compass to eventually reorient myself and found the trail again. One of the biggest reliefs. I made it out with no other incident. However, come to find out the same morning, a 27-year-old died on the same section of the trail as me. It is possible I would have run into him had I not got lost and rejoined the trail later. His family seems to have scrubbed the internet of several of the articles on him, but I'll see if I can find something. The scariest part was knowing that someone knew where I was and watched me. I had no clue about them. My grandpa encountered a wild man while ice skating as a child in rural Idaho. My grandpa was born in the last years of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He has tons of old cowboy stories he would tell us as grandkids. Most of them are funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his brother and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At that time, my great-grandpa was working at a ranch hand, and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho, now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They had hitched sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Pononoke River to ice skate. There were 8 kids altogether, and they were excited to show off their new ice skates from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brothers, there were 3 Robinson kids, Tommy Bear and the Gooch twins. The best spot to skate was next door to the Gooch's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they did fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids spent a couple hours ice skating when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the riverbank opposite them. The kids could only watch as a giant man, covered head to toe in thick black fur, came lumbering out of the bushes. He was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled towards the sleighs, trying to scramble up the riverbank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a foothold because of the skates and fell back towards the ice. The giant was now crossing the river towards them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure this creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway across the river, the ice gave way. It submerged its shins, but was slowed down considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the laces off my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the riverbank and jumped onto the sleigh. As they looked back, the giant man was crossing the riverbank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. It just stood there hollering at the kids and swinging its tree branch. The kids were able to make it back to the Gooch Ranch, where they told their encounter to John Gooch, the twins' grandfather. Word spread quickly in their tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, there was found footprints almost 2 feet in length. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They'd both been bent in half like shoe horses. The tracks headed west into the nearby mountains. The posse followed them as far as they could, but deep snow prevented their travel any further. This creature was never sighted in that area again. This story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country of the Idaho Wild Man. Here is a link to the newspaper article describing the event. 4th column over, 4th article down. That spring, my great-grandpa decided to buy a ranch in the Little Lost River Valley, farther north in Idaho. My grandpa had many other weird and creepy backwoods stories, but he always said that this encounter frightened him the most. He was sure he would have been killed if the giant had broken through the ice and given his brother a chance to cut his laces. Lost time while camping. This happened many years ago when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I wouldn't describe the area I was in as backwoods necessarily, but it was a wooded 100-plus acre ranch. The land is in the southwest part of the United States. My family owns the property, and we have family reunions every year and all stay for about 5 days to camp. There's an area of the ranch where we all set up camp and cook and eat. Getting to that part of ranch requires driving through a small village and several gates for about 2 miles. The first gate beyond the village is slightly past a set of railroad tracks. That's a lot of description, but it's relevant later in the story. Because I'd been camping at the ranch for as long as I could remember, and the land was private, my parents would allow me to go off on my own during the day as long as I didn't go too far. I spent time walking the property near our camp area, looking for arrowheads or trying to catch tadpoles in ponds. On this day, I left the large camp area after lunch, which was around 11:30, and told my mom I was going in a nearby creek. I planned on catching some tadpoles to bring back to camp and be back on time for a swimming trip with my cousins we were planning. They wanted to go to a nearby river, and I really didn't want to miss it. I made it down to the creek and got several tadpoles. I probably spent a total of 15 minutes down there. To get back to camp, I would have needed to either climb up a relatively steep embankment with a lot of loose rock, or circle around on the longer route with a flat trail. I'd usually go up on the embankment, but I didn't have a top for the water bottle I caught the tadpoles with and didn't want to risk slipping and spilling them out or killing them. I never walked the longer trail by myself, but I had with my dad and felt confident I could find my way back to camp on it. As I walked back to camp, I had my head down looking for arrowheads in the washed out areas of the trail. I started feeling a little creeped out as I continued walking. We all know that feeling like someone is watching. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to just getting spooked by on the trail myself. Now the next part, I can't explain whatsoever. It's as if a light switch was turned on or someone snapped their fingers and I came back to reality. Except when I came to, I wasn't on the trail I had been on before. I was near the railroad tracks, and it was completely dark. My mom was standing in front of me, shaking my shoulders and yelling, "Where were you?" Two things I remember really clearly about the moments I came to are, one, the look of fear, anger, and relief in my mom's tearful eyes as she was yelling at me, and two, the confusion I felt about what the hell was going on. The last thing I remembered was walking on the trail back to camp, and now suddenly it was dark, and I was at the railroad tracks leading to the ranch, which was over 2 miles away. The best way I can describe it is to compare it to the movie The Butterfly Effect. The main character would be living in one moment, and suddenly he'd wake up somewhere entirely different. My parents drove me back to camp, and I learned it was about 10:30 p.m. This meant I'd been gone for 11 hours. About 10 and a half of which I can't account for to this day. My parents and all my family had understandably freaked the hell out when I had to return to camp. They had been looking for me all day. I was a really good kid growing up and almost never broke any rules, so my parents were baffled at my behavior. I tried to explain to them that I had no memory of getting to the tracks, but they didn't believe me. They thought maybe I got lost and I was embarrassed to admit it. This was the only time I'd ever experienced something like this. I can't explain how unsettling it was to not be able to account for all those hours I was gone. Was it coincident that I had been creeped out feeling on the trail and then just lost 10 and a half hours of my life? I wish I had answers for what happened. Has anyone had anything else similar happen? My grandfather experienced something in the woods, and the answer died with him. This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I'm now 21 now, and it has never left me. I think about it constantly and ponder over what happened. Our grandfather passed close to a year ago in June of 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues in my family. They don't really pertain to the story, but there are some things about him that I have to share in order to explain the story in the best possible way. Our grandfather, John, was a man who was extremely collused and old-fashioned. He was bitter, abusive, and a complete macho man. My mother was raised on never showing emotion or pain due to his abuse and lack of compassion for others. He was also an extreme racist. He had many secrets in my family that are now coming to light after his death. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because he had more important things to do, like drinking and having affairs. Just an overall intense and very no-nonsense type of man. He also was not religious at all and found things like faith and hope stupid. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely early to mid-70s. My mom was born in 1965 and remembers this story very clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year. One summer day, John decided to take his family on a small outing with the intent to have a picnic in the woods. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother/my grandmother were all there and very excited about this. Where we are from, my family is more than accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for generations. Going into the woods for a fun family activity was nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down a dirt back road and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around as kids do after being stuck together, my grandmother began unloading their supplies and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up. As he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eyes. Before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother thought not much of this. They're all used to the woods, and these woods in particular were very familiar to them. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff they brought. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. This mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be an animal in the woods. There was nothing but squirrels and raccoons in this area. Scattered amongst the mound were larger river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. The mood immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and worried about it, but did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry and continued to play while just avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous, sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a beat. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view from anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange. It was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with rope and hung high above their heads. A lump of dirt could be explained away by nature, but something had to have placed the noose there. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. They couldn't just pack up and leave. John was still out in the woods. Even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become more anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman she is, soothed her children and told them it was just left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart how they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it. At least no sane deer hunter. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they began to really panic. A grandmother, as well as all the children, began hearing a rhythmic chanting from deep in the woods. It sounded as though they were a group of people all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went in a quick bum, bum, bum pattern. 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away before. Immediately, fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volumes. It was getting not just louder, but closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted to so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden, as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate in their chest. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves. Surrounding the family in every direction, suddenly the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go," he yelled, "get in the car." He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave. They had never seen terror on this man as they had at this very moment. He was a man afraid of nothing, unbothered by the world around him. This was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything in the back of the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother picked up their things and as quickly as possible threw it all into the car. They had no care for the things they were packing up. Due to their fear, food was all over the trunk and items were broken. After everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and drove away. This is where the main grunt of the story ends. But one fact from this story is what really has caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children or my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them not to ask again. He never went to the police or told someone outside of the family. My grandfather is the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself I would ask him one day. Now I can't, and I regret it greatly. By the time I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him outside of occasional happy birthday calls or letters. This story doesn't have an answer to go with it. When he died, the only thing I was sad about was never knowing what happened that day. We weren't close when I got older, and once I learned all of the abuse he caused, I separated myself from him. His death looms over me, and this story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood. Nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I am one of the only people in the family who is still curious about what happened. I've always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror, and conspiracy theories. This story piqued my interest more than any others in my family. Which, by the way, this isn't the only strange story from my family, but it definitely is the most strange. I wish I had answers. I hope you all find this story as fascinating as I do. I'll gladly answer any questions, and I would love to hear theories about what was in the woods. Thank you all for reading.